So now we'll go over the atrioventricular septal defect with exclusively atrial level shunting. So in these hearts, we'll primarily be looking from the rightward aspect with both the right atrium and the right ventricle opened up. So we're seeing the rightward aspect of each septum. So obvious to all these specimens is this large scooped out septum, this atrioventricular septal defect. If I removed the AV valve, you wouldn't be able to tell whether this was an AVSD with exclusively atrial level shunting or the so-called primum AVSD versus a complete atrioventricular septal defect with both atrial and ventricular level shunting. Likewise, you wouldn't be able to tell if it was a so-called transitional AV septal defect, which had atrial level shunting and restrictive ventricular level shunting. It's really the position of the AV valve within the AV septal defect which will determine the subtype of atrioventricular septal defect. So here, looking at the atrial septum, in this specimen we have a little cut that's been made during autopsy, but you can see that the atrial septum is intact. Here is the floor of the oval fossa. We have another specimen that will demonstrate this a little nicer, but here's the floor of the oval fossa. There is no additional secundum AVSD, and then the leading edge of the primary atrial septum here is thin and not muscularized. It hasn't fused to the endocardial cushions, and it hasn't formed that anterior-inferior muscular buttress that we see in the normal heart. So that is the developmental basis, and you'll notice all these specimens have this appearance with almost this curtain-like appearance of this thin leading edge of the primary atrial septum. Looking at the AV valves, we see the superior bridging leaflet here, and then the inferior bridging leaflet here. And there is a tongue of tissue connecting between the superior bridging leaflet and the inferior bridging leaflet. Both bridging leaflets are matted completely down to the crest of the muscular ventricular septum, along with this tongue of tissue connecting between both bridging leaflets also being completely matted down to the crest of the ventricular septum, so allowing no ventricular level shunting and only exclusively atrial level shunting. If we come over to the left ventricle, and you can better appreciate this superior bridging leaflet, which has attachments to the crest of the muscular interventricular septum, and there's chordal space between, but there's also attachments on the rightward aspect of the interventricular septum with no chordal spaces between, not allowing any ventricular level shunting. You could say that this is a Rastelli A classification because the superior bridging leaflet is attached to the crest of the ventricular septum. The difference between a complete AV septal defect or one with both atrial and ventricular level shunting is that even though there's attachments to the superior bridging leaflet, they're so firmly attached, especially on the rightward aspect, that it's not allowing any ventricular level shunting, along with that tongue of tissue between not allowing any ventricular level shunting. If we look at this specimen and open up in a similar fashion, viewing from the rightward aspect, we again see the right aspect of both the atrial and the ventricular septums. We see the leading edge of the primary atrial septum again appearing like this thin curtain, which has not muscularized and has not fused to the endocardial cushions, creating this large atrioventricular septal defect, which again has exclusively atrial level shunting. Similar to the last specimen, we look at the interatrial septum and there's no atrial septal defect. The floor of the oval fossa, better appreciated here with the limbus, or so-called secondary septum, and the primary septum being interposed together, so the floor of the oval fossa has no deficiency. There is no atrial septal defect, there is only an atrioventricular septal defect. Coming back to the atrioventricular septal defect, we see the superior bridging leaflet, which is firmly attached to the crest of the ventricular septum with no interchordal shunting. We see the inferior bridging leaflet, which also is matted down to the crest of the ventricular septum. There's no intercordal shunting. There's no ventricular level shunting along with this tongue of tissue between both the inferior and superior bridging leaflets, allowing no interventricular shunting. So exclusively atrial level shunting. Lastly, we'll look at this specimen, focusing on the rightward aspect of the interatrial septum. And different from the prior two specimens, we see a large deficiency in the floor of the oval fossa. This is a large secundum ASD. So here is that limbus or secondary septum, again appreciating that the secondary septum is no more than an infold and that there's epicardial fat within. So if an interventionist were to puncture through an intact atrial septum here, they would go outside the heart into the pericardial space and then back in, and potentially could cause pericardial effusion. So the deficiency is solely in the floor of the oval fossa. And then here is the mouth of the coronary sinus. Here is the eustachian valve, eustachian ridge, the septal leaflet attachment of the tricuspid valve, together forming at its apex the triangle of Koch, with the posterior aspect of it guarded by the mouth of the coronary sinus and the Thebesian valve. We look at the AV valve on this right side, and if we look at it en face, we see that it closes in a trifoliate fashion. So here is the septal leaflet, the anterosuperior leaflet, and then the inferior leaflet has been transected, a portion here and a portion right here. So this is a trifoliate valve on the right side, and we come over to the left side, and this is a bifoliate mitral valve. So here we have the anterior leaflet or aortic leaflet of the mitral valve, and then back here we have, which it's been cut, but the posterior leaflet or mural leaflet of the mitral valve. It's a bifoliate left AV valve or mitral valve. So this is not an AV septal defect. The AV septum is intact, and in this heart, the only portion of the AV septum is going to be the atrioventricular portion of the membranous septum, which is found at the triangle of Koch, which is often found at the commissure between the septal and the anterior leaflet right here, with the ventricular portion covered by the leaflet of the tricuspid valve, and the atrioventricular portion right here. So this atrioventricular septum in the normal formed heart is much smaller than that large scooped out deficient atrioventricular septum in those with AV septal defects.